Alf's going to begin by reading a couple of excerpts that he's picked out from his book, Adivasis in the State. And then after that, I'll just ask some questions to open up the discussion. But while I'm doing that, you guys should feel free to send me your questions using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screens. I think all of you should be able to see it. Obviously, if you have any other complaints with regard to not being able to hear me or Alf, just use the chat option and let us know. So while we're talking, you can keep thinking of your questions and feel free to send them to me whenever. So that's all on the format front. Now to move on to the introduction. So Alf Gunvald Nilsen, I'm sure I've butchered your name, but you also refused to tell me.
No, that was actually pretty good.
He's a professor of sociology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. His research focuses on social movements and the political economy of development and democracy in the global South. Needless to say, he is the author of the book that we're discussing today, Adivasis and the State, Subordination and Citizenship in India's Bhil Heartland, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. So thank you, Alf, for being here with us today and for making the time to have this incredibly important conversation. But before we launch into the excerpts, if there's anything you'd like to say in general or about the book and sort of what it means to you, because I know it was a decade-long labor of love, as you called it, in one of our email exchanges. So really anything you want to begin with.
Well, first of all, thanks to you guys for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to do this and to have these platforms and outlets to talk about important issues during the very challenging time that we're going through. Look, I thought I'd start by explaining where the book comes from. And the process that led to it, so to speak. So the book basically emerged as an idea that I had when I was a graduate student conducting research on the anti-dam movement in the Narmada Valley, which, as many people will know, of course, also revolved very much around Bhil Adivasis who were under threat from displacement, most of whom have now been displaced by the Sardar Sarovar project, which is only one of the many dams that have come up on the Narmada River. Now, when I was doing interviews with activists of the NBA in villages along the Narmada, their stories very often gravitated around movements that had taken place prior to the mobilization against dam building and on other issues than dam building, very much on issues pertaining to how the local state related to Bhil communities, the corruption, the violence, the coercion, all of which I'll have more to say about. That also took me to other issues, if you will, other than just displacement as a concern for Adivasi communities. In general, what started to emerge for me when I was doing the research was two things. That we need to be concerned with the many ways in which Adivasi lives are made to not matter, if you will, in India's political economy. And in doing so, we need to move away from the concern with what might be called spectacular dispossession, the kind of dispossession that's brought about by large dams, by mining and so on and so forth, and to more mundane forms of dispossession, the kind of dispossession that happens on an everyday basis, sometimes through actual disenfranchisement, the fact that Adivasis often find themselves rightless in relation to the state that they are actually citizens of. And I also became concerned with a specific political tradition that had crystallized, that had emerged in what I call the Bhil heartland of Western India, which includes districts in Madhya Pradesh, in Maharashtra, in Rajasthan, and in Gujarat. These were community-based movements that from the late 1960s onwards began organizing and mobilizing around demands that sought to democratize local state-society relations. So I wanted to write the story, if you will, of these movements seen through two particular case studies. In doing so, I also wanted to perhaps add to and complicate a narrative that tends to highlight those large-scale movements against displacement, which the Narmada movement was, and also to correct the assumption that's all too often out and about, not just in India, but globally, that Adivasis somehow find political expression or articulate their political agency through only through the Maoist insurgency in Central and Eastern India. I wanted to write the story of these local community-based movements. I wanted to understand the issues that they mobilized against, what they achieved and what they did not achieve through mobilization. And I wanted to reflect on the political lessons that can be learned through reflecting on those questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction just to sort of set up, if you will, the scenario that I researched as part of making this book. I'm then going to talk through the major arguments of the text quite briefly, and then I'll turn to a little segment from the conclusion, which takes us towards reflections upon lessons for oppositional politics, for subaltern politics, for strategies for what you might call subaltern emancipation towards the end. So if that's okay, and if everyone hears me okay, I will proceed to read a little bit from the introduction. And I'm going to start with a little snippet in Bhil, and it's been a long time since I've been speaking Bhil, so this is going to come out sounding strange, but bear with me. Roskar guarantee Amra Kanunche. The employment guarantee is our law. This is a common refrain among activists of the Jagdit Adivasi Dalit Sangatan, JADS, a local movement of Adivasis and Dalits in Badwani district in western Madhya Pradesh. The statement is remarkable in many respects, not least because it represents a distinct reversal of the entrenched disenfranchisement that has characterized Adivasi relations to the state in the western districts of Madhya Pradesh. As the narrative in this book will show, it also expresses how claims for citizenship mediated by the law have been instrumental in animating this reversal. Indeed, one of JAD's main achievements over the years have been to secure accountability and efficiency in the implementation of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in Pati block of Badwani district. Ever since the NREGA was introduced in early 2006, JAD's activists have confronted the local administration to ensure transparent and effective implementation of the program, making sure, for example, that job cards are issued, that written applications for work are accepted by the administration, and that the minimum wage is in fact paid. Initially, in 2006, state authorities refused to implement work schemes under the NREGA. Consequently, JADS demanded that an unemployment allowance should be given to people who would otherwise have been able to find work under the NREGA. A long and passionate agitation followed, in which activists faced threats of violence and trumped-up criminal charges. Lasting from June to October 2006, the struggle ultimately succeeded in forcing the authorities to pay unemployment allowances to 1,500 to 2,000 applicants. In the following years, Pati block attracted attention as one of the areas in India where the NREGA was being implemented with the highest level of success. A 2008 survey that covered 10 districts across 6 Hindi belt states showed that almost half the workers from Pati who had been interviewed had been able to obtain nearly 100 days of employment through the program. And on average, workers from Pati block had secured 85 days of work under NREGA in the 12 months preceding the survey. This compared very favorably with results from the other states. However, these victories were not easily won. Not only was JADS up against a state apparatus that was loath to pay heed to Adivasi demands, they also challenged elites who were not averse to resorting to repression when confronted with democratic mass mobilization. This became abundantly clear in early May 2012, when a show cause notice was issued to Madhuri Krishnaswamy, a leading JADS activist. In the notice, Madhuri Ben, as she is known in local communities in the district, was called upon by the district magistrate to provide reasons as to why she should not be externed from Badwani and 6 other districts in the state. The reason why the authorities wanted to extern Madhuri Ben was that she and her organization had allegedly hindered, quote unquote, the development work of the administration and created an atmosphere of fear among the government functionaries, again, quote unquote, engaged in the implementation of this work. The move by the Badwani administration was decried by leading national civil society activists like Jean Drèze and Aruna Roy as an unconstitutional attempt at silencing an activist who had dared to challenge the local administration. It soon emerged that of the criminal cases listed in the notice to justify Madhuri Ben's externment, all but one were old cases in which JAD's activists had been acquitted of all allegations. Responding to the allegations made against her, Madhuri Ben pointed out, far from obstructing government schemes, our campaigns and protests have been for the proper implementation of these schemes according to law. In doing so, she argued, JADs had upset the powers that be in the area. She wrote, these interests have been made very uncomfortable by an Adivasi population that is confident, aware, organized, and very vocal in demanding their legal rights. Ultimately, the attempt to drive Madhuri Ben out of Badwani district foundered, in part due to extensive national and international criticism of the district administration. However, a year later, the district administration struck again. Along with 4 other activists, Madhuri Ben was summoned to the offices of the Chief Judicial Magistrate, the CJM of Badwani, in connection with a case from 2008 in which she and other activists had been accused of rioting and assaulting a public servant. The case had been filed after JADs had protested severe negligence at a local primary health center. Although local police had rejected the case due to a lack of evidence, the Badwani CGM refused to accept this and ordered that the case should go to trial. As she initially refused to take bail, Madhuri was jailed for 2 weeks. However, once again, the attempt at repression failed and she was released from prison. Almost every JAD's protest and campaign has been accompanied by false police cases, even though they are always completely peaceful and disciplined, Madhuri pointed out after her release. Most campaigns have been for clear legal rights and entitlements. The main reason for this harassment has been not so much the protests themselves, as because the politician-trader bureaucracy nexus has felt threatened by Adivasi self-assertion and unity. Now, the events that unfolded in Badwani district between May 2012 and May 2013, and the processes from which these events resulted, illustrate the political dynamics that are the key concerns of this book. On the one hand, processes of democratic deepening are set in train when subaltern groups stake rights-based claims in relation to a state that is often not only unaccountable and unresponsive, but also predatory and violent in its everyday workings among the poor. On the other hand, dominant groups mobilize the coercive resources of the state in order to curb the inroads made by subaltern claims-making. In this way, they seek to reproduce existing relations of power in specific locales. These complex processes of negotiation, contestation, and struggle animate a contentious dialectic of power and resistance that is integral to shaping the political economy of democracy and development in contemporary India. New forms of subaltern politics in India mobilize a wide variety of groups, for example, Dalits, poor rural women, informal sector workers, and lower caste peasants, and have destabilized important structures of power that for a long time underpinned the political economy of the post-colonial state. In recent years, these gains have manifested themselves in the introduction of rights-based legislation, the NREGA being a case in point. The considerable advances made by a local social movement such as JADS in terms of ensuring the implementation of the NREGA suggests that rights-based legislation has, and I quote here, reconfigured not only material interactions between the state and India's marginalized, but also the imagined spaces within which marginal groups renegotiate their relationships with the state. However, there is nevertheless something partial and limited about the impacts of these mobilizing processes. This is above all evidenced by the way in which the Indian economy is defined by a socio-demographic pattern in which Dalits, Adivasis, women, small and marginal peasants, and landless and informal sector workers remain systematically overrepresented among the 660 million people who live in poverty in the country today. This pattern combines with ever-widening inequalities to testify to how subaltern groups remain adversely incorporated into power relations that perpetuate uneven and unequal development in India today. It's therefore necessary to ask critical questions about the way in which poorer and less powerful groups can effectively challenge their relegation to the bottom of economic and political hierarchies by using strategies that rely on the institutions, the languages and idioms and procedures and interventions of the Indian state. Now, having read that bit, I think what I'd like to do is to talk through some of the major points in the book, just to give participants an idea of how I try to do precisely this, how I try to raise the questions that I've signaled are important about what subaltern groups can achieve by mobilizing in relation to the state. So I start by looking at state-society relations as they existed prior to the activism of movements such as those that I look at. I focus on two particular case studies, the Kedut Masur Chetna Sangha, the KMCS, which was active predominantly in Alirajpur district of Madhya Pradesh, and the Adivasi Mukti Sangathan, the AMS, which was active in neighboring districts of Bardwani and Kargon. And I try and look at what it was about that state-society relationship that effectively disenfranchised, that effectively made Adivasis rightless. And I described the state-society relationship as what I call everyday tyranny. And what I refer to there is that experiences of encountering the state, the entire relationship to the state in these communities consisted of coercive and corrupt exactions by forest guards, by police officers, and so on and so forth, on the most frivolous of charges. For example, cultivating in the forest, which is formally speaking a violation of Indian forest laws, but entirely integral to Adivasi livelihoods in this region. Or, for example, the way in which the police would exploit community disputes in order to make claims for bribes of various kinds. This could be monetary, they could be bribes in kind, and so on and so forth. And very often these demands were enforced with the use of violence. Now, what that had created was what I refer to as a local rationality, a way of relating to power as it's exercised from above, that was characterized by both fear and resignation. Fear, because people were literally afraid of the state and its representatives and the powers that they wielded. Secondly, resignation, because people had seen this relationship operate in their communities, in their everyday lives for a very long time, and they had come to think of it as the way things were, as something that couldn't really be challenged, that could at best be avoided in small ways, which I also talk about in the book. The idea of making rights-based claims, the idea of resistance per se, was considered to be unthinkable, quite frankly, because there was a received wisdom that if we try to do this, we will be met with coercion, we will be met with punishment, we will be met with force. We cannot do that. I try to explore the historical roots across two chapters in the book, the historical roots of this particular state-society relationship, and I locate it in the impact of colonial state-making on the princely states that ruled these areas prior to independence. And what I document there is that colonial intervention in the governance of princely states basically intensified, if you will, the infrastructural power of the state to such an extent that a far more singular form of sovereignty emerged in this region, where princely rulers could lay down the law, if you will, in a way that they had never been able to before. It put in place the institutions that were the core of everyday tyranny, so the policing, the forest guards, and all the rest of it, and effectively produced Adivasis as rightless subjects in relation to the princely rulers. This relationship was reproduced after independence for reasons that I'm very happy to discuss as we move on to the Q&A. And this was what the mobilization was against. On the one hand, this entrenched structure of feeling that was based on fear and resignation, which again produced deference and acquiescence in relation to the everyday tyranny of the state, and the more deep structures, if you will, of political power that crystallized over a century in this region, stretching from 1820 to independence and beyond. The question then, of course, is how did fearful subjects for whom the state was opaque, something that they didn't know, something that was unfamiliar to them, how did they become assertive citizens who knew how to use the state to press claims? That's what I take up in the second part of the book, which looks at the development of citizenship in this region and a specific form of insurgent citizenship. I start my investigation of that by looking at how middle-class activists, cast into middle-class activists, if you will, from urban centers, came to this region as part of a generation of young people who, in the late 70s into the early 80s, came to be drawn into the sort of the aftermath of the JP movement, when the encouragement was for young people with political commitments to go to the countryside, to organize and mobilize among the rural poor. This also happened here. And the way in which the KMCS and the AMS got started as movements was by these middle-class activists basically rallying Adivasi communities together around specific challenges to specific violations of the law by state officials. For example, a forest guard who had demanded a bribe. For example, a police official that had thrown someone in jail on a trumped-up charge in order to extract a bribe, and so on and so forth. And these sort of mobilizations, these showdowns around specific violations of the law very often yielded a positive result, a result where higher levels in the administration, a higher level police officer or whatever it might be, ordered bribes to be repaid or punished an errant forest guard and so on and so forth. And I try and show how this spawned a new structure of feeling in these communities, a deeply politicized structure of feeling, predicated upon what I call, drawing on Barrington Moore and his work, moral courage. The moral courage to basically stand up and to say that this will not go on anymore, that we expect legality to prevail in state-society relations, and that we expect right to be done by us. So that was, if you will, the basis of mobilization. And it says something about how citizenship is not simply a political status or a set of abstract principles. It's very much a structure of feeling that you are indeed rights-bearing, and that being a rights-bearing citizen enables you to challenge the power that has treated you as less than human for generation upon generation upon generation. I move on from there to investigate the role that law and civil society played in throwing up, if you will, a new idiom of citizenship in the region where I worked, in Western MP, Western Madhya Pradesh. About the law, what I point out is that the law was significant to these movements, but not in the sense that they engaged in judicial activism or used the courts primarily, but rather the fact that they appropriated the law as a hegemonic language of the state and pointed a finger at state officials who violated the law through corrupt and coercive behavior and sought to have that righted. Very often, the strategy was to point out that the law had been violated and to give higher level officials a period of time, let's say 2 weeks, to remedy the wrong. And also saying that if that's not done, we will start collective action. So it was always about combining recourse to the law with the threat of disruptive collective action in what was effectively a form of legalism from below that extracted results by using the hegemonic language of the state. I move on from there to argue that this legalism from below basically brought about a rudimentary civil society, if you will, a space where claims could be made, where previously there had been no such space. Now, I don't write about civil society as this sort of free and open sphere in which liberal rights prevail and everything is hunky-dory. It was a sphere that came with many constraints and many restrictions, as civil society does, because it prescribes a certain mode of political activity over others. But what I do argue, though, is that with all its limitations, this was a necessary step, if you will, in order to move out of a deeply skewed power relationship, to move out of a state-society relation in which Adivasis were effectively rightless. These achievements, the legalism from below, the creation of a civil society, in turn underpinned the emergence of a form of citizenship that starts with very basic claims for the right to have rights, which was also, of course, at the heart of Hannah Arendt's conception of what citizenship most fundamentally is. But then started to develop into something more. I refer to this using James Holston's work on Brazil and also the work of many other authors who have written very insightfully about subaltern politics in the Latin American context. And I argue that this insurgent citizenship, this citizenship that went beyond merely liberal conceptions of civil and political rights, developed around claims for Adivasi self-governance and Adivasi control over natural resources, specifically forest rights, and also a collective Adivasi identity, an identity that in this region of India was based on being the people who had made land inhabitable and cultivable. The indigeneity discourse that we very often associate with Adivasi politics was far less strong here than what we know, for example, from eastern parts of India, from central parts of India, or for that matter from the northeast. And what was significant about this insurgent citizenship was that in claiming self-governance, in claiming control over forest rights and other natural resources, such as water and so on and so forth, they broke with the political role, if you will, or the position of the Adivasi in India's constitutional democracy, which has always been that of a subject that is in need of state protection and state paternalism. So they will be helped from above. What these movements brought to the fore was, of course, Adivasi self-agency. And that is really significant. Being a legal subject, a political subject, an insurgent subject that is capable of sorting out, if you will, their own emancipation, who do not have a need for the state's paternalism. That was what was at the core of the kind of insurgent citizenship that emerged here. As the movements came to constitute a challenge to local elites, they were subjected to repression. And that's where I focus the last substantive chapter on the book. I look at how local dominant groups, both in politics and in the local economic structure, mobilized coercion and repression. Coercion and repression that involved intensive violence, assassinations, and so on and so forth of activists to break the back of these movements. It had a dramatic impact. It scaled back activism massively. People retreated, having learned, if you will, from repression that challenging the powers that be beyond a certain limit is not going to work. People resorted to more NGO-based forms of activism after this, and so on and so forth. And then I move on to thinking about the limits and the achievements of these movements in order to start discussing, if you will, what we can learn in terms of a emancipatory politics for the future. Which brings me back to a bit of reading from the book, if that's okay. I want to read a little bit from the conclusion before I try, just very briefly, to explain the core arguments that I make about what might be a strategy for moving forward with an emancipatory subaltern politics in India. In the late autumn of 2009, reports of a dire food crisis among the Adivasis of Western Madhya Pradesh started to appear in Indian national newspapers. In just 2 villages in Jhabua district, Agasia and Madura, 25 children were reported to have died in the course of only 2 weeks. These children died as a result of malnutrition, which had caused a dramatic fall in their immunity levels, rendering them vulnerable to dengue and anemia. By February 2010, the situation had deteriorated even further. 46 Adivasi children were reported to have died of malnutrition across 3 villages in Jhabua. The malnutrition deaths in Jhabua in the autumn of 2009 were a stark manifestation of the dramatic loss of food security in Madhya Pradesh, where child mortality rates rank among the highest in the world, and levels of malnutrition among children surpass the levels found in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Malnutrition takes a particularly harsh toll on the state's Adivasi population, with 71.4% of tribal children in the state being malnourished and 82.5% suffering from anemia. Whereas the average infant mortality rate in the state stands at 72 per 1,000 per 1,000, the IMR for scheduled tribe areas stand at 95.6 per 1,000. In Jabua and Badwani, the under 5 mortality stands at 96 and 92 per 1,000 respectively, compared to 74 in a comparatively affluent district like Indore. According to the India Human Development Report for 2011, infant mortality rates and under 5 mortality rates are particularly high among scheduled tribes in Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh. 5 years later, very little had changed, with 50% of children in Alirajpur, Dar, Jabua, and Dindori. All districts where more than half the population are Adivasis were reported to be suffering from malnutrition. Responding to the malnutrition deaths in Jabua, human rights activists in the region pointed to the failure of public service delivery to the poorest of the poor as a key problem. Irregularities and shortcomings in the registration of families living below the poverty line in the worst affected districts, serious flaws in the running of key welfare programs such as the public distribution system and the integrated child development scheme, and a severely underdeveloped and underfunded system of public health care were just some of the problems they singled out for criticism. However, the alarming malnutrition rates in Western MP do not just result from the state's neglect of the welfare entitlements of its poorest citizens. They are also a consequence of the erosion of agriculture in the region. Indeed, in August 2009, the leading national newspaper, The Hindu, reported that Jabua district was on its way to becoming Vidarbha 2. Over the past decade, agriculture in the district has witnessed a shift in cropping patterns away from the pulses, coarse grains, and oil seeds that were the mainstay of subsistence cultivation, and towards cash crops such as BT cotton, tomatoes, and chilies. The turn towards high-input cash cropping has come at a high price for local Bhil peasants, primarily in the form of a vicious debt cycle, as peasants have to buy the necessary inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. Now, as I pointed out earlier in the book, agrarian stagnation propels massive flows of labor migration in Western Madhya Pradesh. For the vast majority of migrants, work in the cauldron of Gujarat's informal economy is exploitative and precarious. The vulnerability of Adivasi migrant workers has arguably found its grimmest expression in the tragic fates of many of those who found work in the quartz-crushing units in the districts of Kheda and Godra. A series of official studies have shown air pollution levels in these factories are up to 660 times higher than the threshold value regarded as the international standard limit. Exposure for more than a few months is associated with high risks of contracting silicosis. Due to this risk, local workers steer clear of the quartz-crushing units, which in turn have turned to the border districts of Western Madhya Pradesh and Alirajpur in particular to recruit labor. Bhil workers are hired to feed the stone crushers with quartz rocks and fill bags with silica powder at a rate of 1.5 to 2 rupees per bag. Filling between 600 and 700 bags of silica during a workday that can be anything from 8 to 12 hours long, the workers inhale large quantities of silica dust. This has resulted in a considerable number of deaths due to silicosis among labor migrants from Alirajpur. A 2007 report by a local NGO documented 489 persons from 218 households in the district as having been exposed to silica dust. Out of these, 158 people had died and 266 people were ill with silicosis. In other words, 86% of those exposed to silica dust in Gujarat were either dead or incurably ill, and 94% of the silicosis deaths had occurred within 3 years of exposure to the deadly dust. By 2010, Shilpi Kendra, the local NGO who first documented the spread of silicosis in Alirajpur, reported that the death toll had increased to 386 people across the 3 districts of Alirajpur, Jabua, and Dar. As the majority of those affected by silicosis are primary wage earners for their families, their illness and deaths have a direct bearing on the livelihoods of a great number of Bhil households in the region. Not only do these households lose in income, they also accumulate large debts through paying for healthcare for family members afflicted with the illness. Nevertheless, continuous petitioning at the level of local authorities in Madhya Pradesh, petitions to relevant authorities in Gujarat, and appeals to the National Human Rights Commission and the Supreme Court between 2003 and 2008 yielded neither factory closures nor compensation to the afflicted families. Dying from malnutrition, dying from working. These are markers of Adivasi subalternity, and they are also markers of the limits of subaltern resistance in the Bhil heartland. Despite the considerable democratization of local state-society relations, and in spite of the making of a political culture of insurgent citizenship, the fundamental power relations that constitute Adivasis as a surplus population who are disproportionately exposed to premature death within the regional political economy still prevail. This begs a fundamentally political question, which is how it might be possible to organize and mobilize an oppositional project with the capacity to rupture the structures of class and caste power that constitute the kernel of the hegemonic formation in which Bhil Adivasis of Western Madhya Pradesh are adversely incorporated. In the rest of the conclusion, I try to set out an answer to that question. I begin by asserting that the strategy of armed insurgency, which we see in some parts of India, has little to offer in terms of bringing about realistic prospects of emancipation. I argue instead for a strategy that's founded upon what André Gortz argued or called non-reformist reforms, which is basically a strategy that seeks to bring about reforms of an existing system that in turn can create the preconditions for further and more radical change. I move on from having situated non-reformist reform as the strategic core of a possible future politics of emancipation to argue that a starting point for such non-reformist reform might be the rights-based legislation that was brought in under the UPA regime that lasted from 2004 to 2014. Not because these laws are necessarily particularly subversive in and of themselves, laws rarely are, but because they can be made to be subversive through collective action. And I outline different ways in which one can envision that happening. I also argue that mobilizing around rights-based legislation must be combined with a strategy that seeks to transform political regimes at state level. There's a sense in which discussions about subaltern politics and subaltern emancipation in India disregards these long entrenched structures of power that effectively determine the political economy and therefore also the livelihoods, the life worlds, the basic humanity, if you will, of subaltern groups such as the Bhil Adivasis at my level or in my case study. And I argue that challenging entrenched structures of caste and class power also requires, of course, working across the class-caste divide in politics, a divide which has still to be successfully negotiated and transcended, I think, in the Indian context. This then is where I end. Since I concluded my book, which was in the summer of 2017, much has changed. We have seen the Hindu nationalist right-wing regime of Narendra Modi move from a discourse of development to a discourse of unbridled Hindu nationalism, which effectively erodes the citizenship of many vulnerable population groups in India, many vulnerable citizens in India. And we also have seen, of course, with the recent COVID outbreak, the widespread, the thoroughgoing nature of the failure to extend social rights and social citizenship to vulnerable groups, to the working poor, who constitute, as far as I'm concerned, as much as 60%, if not more, of the Indian population, which therefore also commands us, I think, to think about what it might mean to mobilize around demands for citizenship in its various dimensions in the current conjuncture. And I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, Alf. That's definitely incredibly informative, and I think that's going to give our participants enough fodder for their questions. We've already gotten a question from Heba. Heba, I hear you, and I'm going to weave your question into our conversation. Likewise, the rest of you can send in your questions as well. I just wanted to begin by picking on some of the themes that you spoke about in whatever you read out. And I guess one of the main things that stood out to me was that you spoke about how these Adivasi activists were relying on the law. And that was certainly what your interest was in discussing, how they're relying on the law to strengthen their claims to citizenship, or strengthen what that citizenship means in substantive terms in some sense. And I mean, we're certainly, as for example, the Narega bit that you read out, right? That they were concerned with improving the accountability and efficiency of Narega. And I mean, these are certainly, this is something that we also see in current day protests, where, for example, as part of the anti-CAA NRC movement, citizens are holding the Constitution very close to them. During, while protesting that law. So I guess my question was, I mean, you certainly speak about how, in some sense, the reason they use the law as a means to challenge state power is because the law is hegemonic in that, like, pointing this out allows them to point out the hypocrisy of the state in some sense. But I was wondering if there's something more to the draw of the law, if you will, in addition to the angle of using the hegemonic language to turn it around, because certainly, I mean, we're also living in times when the law is not the only hegemonic language, right? So I guess if you could say a little bit more about why the law.
Well, I think it was, first of all, practical circumstances. When you look at the movements that I studied, there were flagrant violations of law. There were folks, meaning the middle class activists, who intervened in the situation from the outside, who were able to begin a process of dialogue where you could articulate, where communities could articulate, in a sense, their experience of being subjected to such flagrant violations of law altogether. And then that gets hooked up to the fact that there's a hegemonic compulsion in the law. Now, what I mean by that is that I'm not in any way in the book singing the praises, if you will, of the law in a liberal sense as some kind of great equalizer. We know what the law is. At the end of the day, the law is the backbone of the state's coercive power. It's what enables the law, if you will, to implement coercion and to carry that out. But the thing is that ideology, which is at the heart of liberal law, that ideology which says that law is the great equalizer, can be used with great effect precisely because you can hold up the violation of it, and you can hold the state accountable to that. E.B. Thompson made a point in his 1975 book, Whigs and Hunters, that the law cannot simply claim to be just, it has to also be seen to be just. That is, the public at large has to see the law working as some kind of equalizers if they are in any way to accept the legitimacy of what hegemonic ideology proposes about the law. That was what was being used there, and I think it testifies to a generic aspect, if you will, an aspect of subaltern politics that we find everywhere, that it revolves around very often appropriating the idioms of the state, appropriating the procedures of the state, such as submitting a complaint or filing an FIR or filing a case or whatever it might be, and turning that against those who hold power. So that was, in a sense, the most important aspect of this for me. The additional aspect is, of course, that law is never simply about the legal text as it stands. The legal text is one manifestation of the law, but the law tends to become something else when it's appropriated, when it's made use of by subaltern groups who are pressing for claims. Very often they push the boundaries of the meanings of the legal text as it has been set down by those who make the laws. And in doing so, they also push, if you will, for a space where visions of what an alternative situation might look like. A situation where, in the case of Bhil Adivasis, very simply legality prevailed in state-society relations. But again, if you look at the claims around citizenship that these groups made, it was grounded, specifically the claim for Adivasi self-governance, it was grounded in laws that were introduced to advance panchayat rule, basically, in scheduled areas. But it became more than that, right? It very quickly became more than that because it became a claim for rights linked to a collective Adivasi identity, which challenged, if you will, state ownership of resources. That's significant. That's really significant when we look at the weight, if you will, of what state ownership of land, state ownership of resources, and so on has enabled in terms of dispossession of Adivasi communities over time, right? So what these groups were basically doing was they were taking their point of departure in an existing law, and as they appropriated that law, they built on it to create something more radical, something that challenged the state's eminent domain, something that challenged the role of the state as a purported deliverer of welfare and protection, and so on and so forth. So I think that's also something that we need to bear in mind, that the mobilization happens around and through law. It's not necessarily constrained within that sort of the legal black box that the powers that be intended the law to be. It becomes something more. It becomes a counter discourse, an ideology of resistance rather than an ideology of dominance and hegemony. And I think that's really important to bear in mind when we look at how supporting groups mobilize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely very helpful. Thank you for sharing that. So now we've got a bunch of questions in from people, and I don't want to put those off too long lest we run out of time. So we're going to start weaving those in. Heba sent in a question. I think she had another question before this, but for some reason we don't seem to have received it. She says this is the second part of her question. And here she's talking about how the Adivasi mobilization required a necessary step of the middle-class civil society activists rallying them for their rights, like you said. It ties in with the argument that the Adivasis did not or could not have imagined resistance otherwise, again, something James Scott may problematize. So I think they're interested in asking if you could say a little bit more on the process of ethnographic immersion, or laying bare the scaffolding of field navigation that often gets lost in the finished product. How you navigate the field, in what capacity did your interactions take place, perhaps a little bit on your positionality in generating the situated knowledge that informs your argument.
Sure. Well, let me start with the first. I very often get this question, and I do understand it, the question about middle-class intervention. I'd like to start first by saying that I'm not positing middle-class intervention into conditions of subalternity, into conditions of great oppression and great exploitation, as being always and everywhere a precondition for subaltern resistance and subaltern opposition to happen. I'm saying that it was what happened in this context, and I try to understand the dynamics of how it happened. The reference to James Scott is, of course, interesting. I have a footnote that's almost a page long in my book discussing why Scott's notion of hidden transcripts only goes so far, if you will, in terms of addressing the scenario that I found in communities where I worked. To put it very simply, I looked and I looked and I looked for everyday acts of resistance. I asked about various forms of resisting power behind its back, so to speak. Very little came up. I'll give you a couple of examples though. Like, people would say that, well, sometimes when we had chopped down a tree in the forest or chopped down trees in the forest to build a house, we would bury them in the ground for a month in order to make them look old before we built our houses with them. Now, obviously, that's a way of evading and thereby also resisting the power of the state. But it's not a way of resisting the power of the state that happens through confrontation. And it therefore doesn't do much in terms of rupturing existing power relations. And when you then touched upon whether or not people imagined resisting, the response was most often, are you mad? Do you know what we would have been subjected to if we had done that? So I suppose what I'm saying is that what I found was a situation in which it took this intervention from the outside to bring about resistance. It had a certain dynamic. It certainly had its problems in terms of the relations that developed over time, and conflictual relations that developed over time, which I also deal with in the book, between urban middle-class activists and Adivasis. In the case of one of these movements, it played a role in leading to its disintegration at a certain point. But rather than sort of approaching that from a moral angle, I think it's more important to approach it simply from the angle of, this is what happened. Okay, what actually happened? Look at the details of it, and approach it like that. And I also think that the sort of the Scott approach, which is that subaltern groups always, reject power, and that there's always this sort of almost perfectly oppositional subject hiding behind this sort of official public transcript of acquiescence and deference, is not necessarily correct. I think it underestimates what happens, among other things, to what I refer to in the book, drawing on on work in sort of queer studies and work on queer politics, as an emotional habitus woven around feelings such as fear and resignation, and that creates a local rationality, a way of handling power from above that doesn't confront. And I think we need to take that into account. I think that if we don't, I think we underestimate, the weight of domination on subaltern people and what it can do to the kind of strategies that you develop simply to ensure your own survival. So that's my response to the question around middle class intervention. When it comes to questions of the field and so on and so forth, let me start by saying that the book is based on the collective collection of life histories from activists. What I mean by that is that I ended up almost inadvertently, certainly not due to any sort of pre-planned grand design, to research these movements in a participatory way. That happened as follows: that I contacted two former KMCS activists, urban middle class activists, who were running a school in the region where I worked, a school for Adivasi children. There are hardly any functional state schools in this area, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to interview them about their activist experience, their memories of having been played a leading part, in fact, in the KMCS, which they gladly did. When I then shared my plans for the project, they made me another cup of tea, and they insisted that I sit a little bit longer. And they said, look, why don't you do it in collaboration with us? Why don't you try and work with some of the folks who are teachers here in the school, who happen to be young Adivasi adults between 18 and maybe in their early 20s, all of whom had parents who had been involved with these movements. And it took me about the blink of an eye to agree to that. And we then began a process where we did workshops around what research is, about what these movements are, discussing how these teachers who would be part of the research team had their own experiences of the movement, for example, in the form of parents being arrested or parents being away a lot because they were busy organizing and mobilizing. We developed an interview guide in local languages, and we started a process of 1.5 years, where we sort of became this sort of traveling team that journeyed around 3 or 4 districts in Madhya Pradesh, collecting life histories from altogether 70 Adivasis. Now, obviously, the question of positionality in all this is an important one. I mean, I come from an incredibly privileged background in the sense of being from the global north. I'm intensely aware of the fact that I inhabit all sorts of incredibly privileged identities all in one go. And of course, at the end of the day, I'm also the one who gets on the plane and heads out of this vastly deprived region that I worked in. And all I can say with that is that it poses all sorts of contradictions that I don't think we solve in any absolute way, or that we find absolute moral responses to it. We just negotiate it as we go along. And one of the ways in which I negotiated was, of course, this collaborative research strategy. By the end of it, we had an archive of sorts, consisting of films and recordings of activist life histories that remained with the school that I referred to as a resource for them to use. That also became this book, and that's, in a sense, my approach to this. I don't necessarily think that you're going to get very far by being on the barricades with absolutes around this. I think rather you keep remembering, when you are a privileged person doing this kind of work, that you are privileged, that there are things that you will never be able to understand quite fully, because you're not going to understand that form of oppression that people are talking about, or the risks, for example, that they ran in being active in these movements. But you can try, and it's always a question of trying your best with the awareness that you're working from a position that enables you to see and do certain things, but also prevents you from seeing and doing certain other things.
Thank you for saying that. And I think just to quickly respond to some of the things you said, firstly, I really like that you spoke about structures of feeling, because I mean, I haven't seen a lot of that discussion outside of feminist and queer studies, and that's certainly where my academic background is. So I find that angle incredibly interesting, and I find that it makes for a good, I guess, synthesis of disciplinary ideas, which then, of course, become interdisciplinary. And secondly, I mean, to everyone who's listening, and I'm sure some of them might know this, it's really nice to have somebody admit that fieldwork is not what you plan at the outset, and that a lot of the times it involves throwing your plan out of the window or reworking it, and that it must then necessarily be dynamic and collaborative. So thank you for pointing both of those out. Let's move on to our next question by Amani. Amani says, could you talk about how Adivasi groups and community-based movements have interacted with broader rights-based social and environmental movements in India? And what are your thoughts on building a collective identity for Adivasis for recognition to give them more political power?
Sure. So in terms of the first part of that question, so building links with, let's say, rights-based networks, environmental groups, and so on and so forth, that's definitely there, but it was much more of a feature, I feel, and I think, in the case of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which I wrote my first book about, that was, in a sense, an aspect of their activism that enabled them to be a national level movement, that also enabled them to be a very visible movement at an international scale. But having researched that movement quite thoroughly, written a book about them, and so on and so forth, I must say that, and I don't mean this to sort of diss or throw shade on the importance of solidarity, but what struck me about, for example, about the Narmada movement was the fact that even though they mobilized transnationally with great success to get the World Bank to withdraw funding from the Sardar Sarovar Dam, which was one of the biggest victories of the NBA, of the Narmada movement, they nevertheless weren't able to move the national state, right? So there is a sense in which the question of the power relations that you're engaging with when you're mobilizing at different scales is one that we need to take very seriously, and one that we need to bear in mind when we think about what works and what doesn't work in movements such as this. And at the end of the day, that's pretty much the only question that's of any significance, certainly in the long run. These smaller movements that I've researched had access to networks and groups in urban centers. Very often these were groups that provided services, for example, in relation to the law. When an activist was thrown in jail on a trumped-up charge, or when there had been police brutality and so on and so forth, the fact-finding team, which is a sort of feature, if you will, of the way in which solidarity is practiced in the Indian context has also been important, incredibly important. For example, when the Adivasi Mukti Sangathan was being subjected to an onslaught of state terror, when large numbers of activists were thrown behind bars, when one activist was murdered while in custody, and so on and so forth. The fact-finding team and the journalists, the progressive journalists who write about these things, were very important. But at the end of the day, certainly my focus has been on what went on the ground, if you will, at the local level in the case of KMCS, AMS, and at the national level when I looked at the Narmada anti-dam movement, because at the end of the day, that was where these struggles were, in a sense, settled in very crucial ways. What was the second part of the question again? Sorry, I got lost there.
The second part of the question was your thoughts on building a collective identity for Adivasis for recognition to give them more political power.
Well, I think that it's obviously important to build politics around a collective Adivasi identity, quite simply because there is such a thing as Adivasi communities being profoundly subaltern within India's political economy. We're talking about a population group which constitutes 8% of India's population, more or less. But which nevertheless at the same time constitutes some 30% of the poorest decile of India's population. I mean, just things like that should make it clear that we here have, if you will, a segment of the population that for which there has to be an insurgent identity to rally around. But when we talk about collective Adivasi identities, I think we also need to be a bit careful about how that often leads to homogenizing assumptions. We tend to think of Adivasis everywhere as being all the same. And the thing for me is that my experience of some 20 years, if you will, on and off, of trying to make sense of and understand both the kind of positions that Adivasi communities have in India's political economy and what they do to resist that, has pointed out that there is no such homogeneous terrain, for example. If you look at the region that I worked in, it's not a region that has been characterized so much by, the sort of the large-scale displacement processes that we think of when we think of a state like Jharkhand, for example, or Odisha. Sure, there were Narmada Dam projects, but the struggles in sort of Western India has been much more about the local state and how it acts in relation to Adivasi communities, and also local landowning groups and so on and so forth, and how they exploit Adivasi labor. The assertion of indigeneity and the tapping into, if you will, transnational discourses of indigeneity, of being the first inhabitant and so on and so forth, has been much stronger in Eastern India, in Jharkhand again, and other areas as well, more recently in Odisha, and in the Northeast than it has in Western India. I think that in Eastern India, this has very much to do with the fact that due to the impact, the long-term impact, among other things, of missionaries there was an emergence of a distinctive class of Adivasi middle-class intellectuals who articulated that identity over time, who in doing so also tapped into transnational networks and sort of represented the struggle that they were involved in more global transnational terms of indigeneity. In Western India, again, which I know far better than sort of Eastern India, what we see there is much more a kind of almost an sort of subaltern or oppositional Lockean discourse, by which I mean sort of the John Locke's argument that you make the soil your own by cultivating it. And Adivasis are pretty much saying that look, we it's not so much about being first inhabitants, but or Aboriginal inhabitants, but saying that we came here and we made this place a place where you can work and you can live, and that's it. That settles it. It's ours. And there's far less of the tapping into transnational discourses. So when we think about building that collective identity, I think it's important to be really attentive to those specificities and what they entail for the building of solidarities. And I also think that it's necessary to remember that there's a need to extend beyond the Adivasi identity as well, to link to other subaltern groups. This has become very evident to me in the context of Madhya Pradesh, where you have a state which has not yet seen what Christophe Jaffrelot and others argue or refer to as the silent revolution. The coming together politically, in party politics specifically, of Dalit groups and OBC groups to challenge entrenched patterns of upper caste and upper class rule, right? So in MP, it's still very much that sort of entrenched structure of power based on the erstwhile princely rulers, and very much so the upper economic crust of the state that holds power. There hasn't been that kind of trajectory of collective Dalit and OBC mobilization to destabilize that, which is why I think that it's also necessary to think beyond the box, if you will, of Adivasi collective identity. And let's remember that on the one hand, so much of the forms of oppression and the forms of exploitation that I talk about in the book are linked to that overall power structure in the state, to that overall political economy. While on the other hand, if you look at the areas where Adivasis are in a majority, they're just a very few districts. So if you're going to have the power of numbers, which is very often what the power of subaltern groups reside in, being the oppressed, the exploited majority, then you need to build that majority by building links outside it and not get trapped within identity boxes.
Mm-hmm. Great. So now I'm just going to take, so we've gotten quite a few questions. I'm going to take maybe two at a time just to make sure we don't leave any out.
Sure.
So the first question is by Ashutosh, who says, Adivasis are taking help of the law, which is luckily on their side in some situations, like the Forest Rights Act. But even then, Adivasis haven't been able to make the most of it. Can you explain a little bit in this regard as to where Adivasis might have failed? I think he means where they might have failed to make the most of the law. So, for example, in cases where the law does favor them.
Yeah, sure. So the obvious example here is the Forest Rights Act, and that was a significant piece of legislation. It was perhaps the most progressive piece of rights-based legislation that was introduced under the UPA. I would point everyone towards the scholarship of Anand Vedya at Reed College, who has shown so clearly how activists played a crucial role in drafting the Forest Rights Act and writing it in such a way that it creates openings for Adivasi mobilization using that law to become something even more than what it was in terms of its actual text. The problem is, in a sense, quite simple, which is that ruling groups, dominant groups, don't just sit by and let subaltern claims making happen. Sometimes they concede to it. They concede to it very often when either they can do so without too much of a cost. So, for example, when, let's say, a senior police officer in Western MP fires a constable, that's something that you can shrug off. It's not of much consequence. But when it comes to something more serious, like disrupting local trader networks who are very often involved, for example, in smuggling out illegally felled timber and so on and so forth, you're messing with something more fundamental, and they stop conceding so easily. So the dominant groups also, of course, concede when what they're facing is a wave of subaltern mobilization that's of such a magnitude that it actually threatens a much more fundamental transformation unless you compromise with it. But when they don't compromise, they fight back. And that's, of course, what's happened around the Forest Rights Act. It's been wildly undermined. It was undermined under the UPA, if you will, if you look at the implementation at state level, and that's where things get really crucial. We see that in only very, very, very few cases was there, a serious commitment from the state to implement the law. In most cases, it was vastly undermined. And then the Modi regime came along and more or less declared war on the Forest Rights Act. I mean, the Modi regime has declared war on many pieces of rights-based legislation because extending rights to subaltern citizens is not something that they do, given that they have the snake oil of Hindu nationalism to sell. And that's where the major losses have kicked in. The way in which, when you get an emancipatory law in place, or at least a progressive law in place, let's call it that, the response has come in the form of a constant attempt to undermine it. And that, in a sense, then testifies, I think, to the limitations of operating only within a legal domain. I think there's a lot that can be achieved through the law. I think it would be foolish to adopt a sort of absolutism that says that the law is a bourgeois construct and it's how the state is able to act as the guardian of the interests of the upper classes, and therefore we shall have nothing to do with it. I think that's foolish. I think that shows a lack of any kind of understanding of the exigencies, the direct challenges of mobilizing at an everyday level in actual life, where you do what you can with the tools that you have access to. But it's also a point here of refusing to limit yourself to that box, because you will need to build, if you will, a capacity for disruptive and transformative collective action beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you answered one of my questions for sure, which was, again, similar, a question of coalition. Let's move on to the 3 questions that we have. So because we're close to 6:45, I'm just going to tell our attendees that we won't be taking more questions from them, just to make sure we can answer the ones that we already have. Oh, well, seems like I got 2 more. So anyway, let's just try to do this. Okay. I feel like everybody just heard the announcement and was like, let me send my questions in.
That's fine. I've got time.
Okay, great. So one of the anonymous attendees has asked, I wonder if you can say more about the dynamics of collective identity. What are the oppositional forces we can imagine here? Is it community versus the state?
I think for me, it's really fruitful to think about the category of subaltern, if you will, in ways that aren't merely analytical. but in ways that are political, which is how the term was coined in the first place by Gramsci. It was not a code word for working class. It was a way of talking about oppression, exploitation, and so on and so forth, as something that was always really complex and really interwoven, so that if you find yourself at a disadvantage within a given social structure, whatever that social structure might be, it's very seldom that that disadvantage flows along one axis alone, let's say class, let's say caste, let's say gender, let's say race, whatever it might be. It's always a coming together of multiple forms of exploitation and oppression. And of course, this should resonate with contemporary discussions around intersectionality and all the rest of it. And I think it's important to be aware of the long and complex heritage of that particular idea here. When we talk about that, it wasn't something that was coined in the 1980s. You know, people who have been involved in activist work and critical intellectual work have been talking about this and trying to make sense of it for a very long time. So what I think needs to be at the heart of the building of oppositional collective identities right now is precisely that, an awareness that we always mobilize along several axes of exploitation and oppression, and insisting on bringing those together. We know, and I realize that I'm getting myself potentially into trouble here, but we know that mobilizing only along axis of class disregards the way, in the Indian context, that caste operates as a vector of social injustice. But at the same time, we know that mobilizing strictly along the lines of caste does very little to alleviate those forms of exploitation and oppression that have produced a distinct pattern in the Indian context, where lower caste groups and Dalits are, suffering great economic injustice. So the compulsion, I think, is to try and develop oppositional collective identities that are spacious and capacious enough to handle overlapping identities, overlapping forms of injustice, and to address that, those intersections, if you will, in a way that that is capable of bringing about systemic transformation. The point is to not paint oneself into a corner precisely when the situation is such, when the need of the hour is such as to get out of one's corner and to make the links between different groups suffering different forms of injustice, and to identify the source of that injustice and to go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as part of your answer, you also answered one of the other questions we had gotten, which was from Sanchita, about what are the inherent limits, or are there any inherent limits to oppositional politics in your opinion? But clearly, I mean, oppositional politics, as you define it, is quite an expansive notion. Is there anything more you want to say about?
Well, when you talk about limits to oppositional politics, I mean, to sort of borrow a little phrase from Stuart Hall, it would be to say that it's always oppositional politics without a guarantee. Mm-hmm. You know, there's no guaranteed victory on the horizon. You know, as warm and fuzzy and nice as that idea might make us feel, there is no such thing on the horizon. That victory can only be made, right? But it's being made in the context of deeply unequal power relations that are ultimately held together by coercive force. And that's really important to think about. And that's, again, where the compulsion comes about, to operate with expansive categories that can build the strength of subaltern groups to mobilize from below.
Yeah. I think one thing we're definitely getting from the session is a sense of your bibliography, because a lot of interesting thinkers have been named, and I'm sure everyone's glad that that has happened and is hoping to explore more such works. Let's see. So we have a question. Again, I think this question you had sort of answered before, but in case there's anything more you want to say on the subject, it's from another anonymous attendee, and they're talking about the role of middle-class activists again. And they say that although, you know, middle-class activists' role in sort of fostering resistance among the Adivasis may have been crucial in the case that you explore, how do you critically assess the role of outsiders Does it carry any moral or ethical codes on the formats of resistance or a particular understanding of grievances? This being said in the context that Adivasis had in the past mobilized themselves on their own, say in the case of the Bhil rebellion or the Coal rebellion, etc. So how do you compare them?
Well, look, I think what the kind of middle class leadership that I looked at brought was a particular organizing format. You know, it's noticeable. It's important, I think, to note that the two movements that I studied all referred to themselves as Sangat or Sangadan, and that was, of course, in a sense, a political forum that emerged very much to the fore of popular resistance and ways of organizing and mobilizing in the 70s with what we call new social movements in it. Sort of template that was brought, and that template, one can discuss whether it has exhausted itself. I think there are many activists who were involved in these movements who would say that it has, and as a result of one thing in particular, which is that the rural communities that they began mobilizing in are no longer, strictly speaking, rural communities. They're actually part of the massive migratory labor force that fuels the fires of accumulation in India's economy, and that have been completely sold down the river by the Modi regime and their response to the COVID crisis and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a lot of this is about the templates that are brought to it. One would be working on a very difficult and very counterfactual terrain if one was to ask what would happen if that intervention was not there. What kind of political agency would emerge? Is the emergence of a young youth-based Adivasi organization in the areas where I worked in Western MP, without any kind of middle-class incursions and so on and so forth. And what that brought out to me was, in a sense, that the kind of political culture that was created by these two movements that I looked at, and in the wider region by a whole history of the political tradition that I'm concerned with, it goes through its period of growth and so on and so forth. It goes into decline, but it never quite goes away. And then it gets seized on by new generations who draw on it, but who don't exactly replicate it and create new forms of unpredictable political agency. And those dynamics, to me, are interesting, and I think they're more useful might have looked like if they were different, because we don't know. I'm a big proponent of studying subaltern politics as it actually exists, rather than engaging in fantasies about what it looks like, which arguably too many people have done over the years. When you come to the question of Bhil rebellions, a huge part of my book is documenting how those rebellions took place from the 1820s onwards, as the process of colonial state formation began. And it's very clear, of course, that Bhils were capable of their own political action in those rebellions. But the conjuncture that I write about in the book, which was a conjuncture where it was actually necessary with this intervention from the outside to catalyze new collective action, new resistance from below, was one where those movements had been suppressed, where an initial attempt at mobilizing Bhil Adivasis in the 1960s had also been brutally repressed, creating a conjuncture. A conjuncture is not something that's absolute. It's a situation that emerges out of the coming together of several processes, and that can also be undone. But nevertheless, a conjuncture where oppositional collective action were considered by the Bhils themselves as being something that wasn't possible. And that the best thing that you could do with the power that you have to live with, the power that insisted that your money was their money, that your chickens were their chickens, that your ghee was their ghee, that the state could take away whatever from your household, was one that was best handled through acquiescence and through deference. And again, this is about being real, I think, about what the weight of power does in certain conjunctures.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have about 7-8 minutes left. I'm going to bunch the questions we have remaining into two sort of broad sets of questions. So that should save us some time. And I think at most we'll run like a few minutes over time. So the first set of questions is about, one attendee asks, how So about the role of neoliberalism in sort of creating the state of poverty in which indigenous communities exist. And then I guess the flip side of that question, which another attendee has asked, is what is the role that technology, mobile phones, social media, if accessible at all, can play or do play in making subaltern resistance more effective?
Okay, yeah. Right. So in the first question, I touch upon many of the impacts of neoliberalism as a political and economic project in the last part of my book, where I try to bring out how incredibly significant Adivasis are to the economic growth processes that India has experienced since the turn to liberalization in the 1990s. I think that that's, for me, in a sense, one of the major manifestations here of neoliberalism in this context. That and the deepening of the agrarian crisis in the region, the fact that subsistence agriculture is quite simply not capable of being a foundation for dignified life anymore, which is then, of course, intrinsically related to labor migration. And then there is the fact that you could talk about the fact that the state provides so little by way of social protection for these communities as another manifestation. But here we need to be really honest and say that it's not as if the developmentalist, the state-oriented regime that preceded the neoliberal age and order in India did any better at all. And this takes us, of course, to discussions around what's actually new about precarity, especially in the global south. And especially for those who are the most exploited workers in the global south. It's important, I think, to be aware that there are limitations to which you can arrive in deprived rural areas such as this and delineate a clear difference between, a previous phase of state-oriented development and an ongoing phase of neoliberal development. But if I was to identify it, it would be in the intensification of labor migration. And the important role that labor migration has played in bringing about India as an expanding economy up to 2016, when economic mismanagement by the current powers that be has sent the economy into something of a tailspin, and the fact, of course, that all of these processes are occurring in the context of an Indian countryside that's sinking deeper and deeper into crisis. When it comes to the question around mobile phones and so on and so forth, I mean, it's been interesting. I sort of carried out fieldwork in this region over 20 years. And when I started, there was no such thing as a mobile phone. In the middle of the period, there was mobile phones, but there were no towers. So your mobile phone was more like, a piece of bling that worked only when you went to the nearest market town or the nearest urban center. And then the towers arrived. And they have made things easier. But you would have to ask others who have carried out more recent fieldwork in the region what it has done in terms of mobilizing potential more recently. I would, of course, say that as much as it creates mobilizing potential for progressive groups, it also, of course, creates a possibility for mobilizing for non-progressive groups and reactionary groups. I mean, we know that WhatsApp has provided an enormously important platform for Hindutva groups who are constantly trying to make inroads into these areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the last question, this was also a question I had, is from Dr. T. Firstly, Dr. T, if you're still with us, I just want to say I'm very sorry for how long I've held off on your question. That was only because I think it's a great closing question. So I wanted to maybe end with this one. So Dr. T writes, it would be great if Alf could speak briefly about the forms and modalities of resistance and activism in the post, if not, in the COVID-19 phase when, migrant laborers, homeless, displaced communities are suffering, but maybe in the post-corona reconstructive phase. And where does one look for the rise of the vanguard, so to say, or will the desperation and destitution find revolutionary outlet over and above communal and casteist tendencies? And yeah, so that was also something that I was thinking about, just the question of, like I was speaking with you earlier, I think one of the reasons why this conversation, the conversation we're having right now, doesn't feature very prominently in even, quote unquote, liberal discourses is because there's a very strong process of othering of the Adivasi community that goes on. And we tend to think of them as anti-legislation, which is clearly not the case, as your study suggests, anti-development, anti-modernity, etc. And I mean, I think...
All right. Well, let me start with the last part of your question and then work towards the current conjuncture. I want to say something about the Adivasi as other. So in the Indian context in particular, but also transnationally, there's a sense in which the Adivasi is considered to be a very distant other, as being other in terms of, the cultural mainstream and so on and so forth, but also being an other that inhabits these very remote locales, beyond the pale, if you will, of urban civilization, and sort of as being cut off from India's modernity. The point is this, that there's nothing that could be further from the truth. Adivasis, as far as I'm concerned, are at the heart of India's modernity, and they are at the darker sections of the heart of India's modernity because their land and their labor have played such important roles in fueling the economic development of the Republic for a very long time, and especially since independence. It's their land that gets occupied by dams, by mines, by industrial parks, and so on and so forth. All of those investment strategies, if you will, that fuels India's economic growth are so closely intertwined with dispossession. And we're talking about large-scale processes here. We're talking about Adivasis, again, being 8% of the population, but at least 50% of those who have been displaced by dams alone since independence, right? We're talking about people who have overwhelmingly been made to suffer the downside of economic growth in that sense, and that also goes to their labor. Adivasis are crucial among the 120 million strong migrant workforce that's currently in dire straits as a result of how Modi's response to the COVID crisis basically had, pardon my French, zero fucks to give about the working poor, absolutely zero, which resulted in the destinies that we've seen unfold with migrant workers making their way back to villages in a countryside riddled in crisis and having that as their best option, walking alongside these highways. Now, when they're not walking alongside interstate highways, they're of course part of the workforce that builds the houses and the apartment buildings that the middle class inhabits. They're not remote. They're at the heart of India's modernity. They're at the heart of an incredibly unequal, incredibly uneven modernity. So that needs to be borne in mind when we're thinking about the Adivasi as other. The Adivasi isn't other in that sense. The Adivasi is part and parcel of the unevenness that allows for middle-class affluence in a country like India. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about oppositional politics in the current conjuncture. I think that what we've seen in the past, let's say 6 years since Modi first assumed power in 2014, is an increasingly aggressive Hindu nationalism coming to overlap with the inequalities of neoliberal development in India. I think that has led to a combined attenuation of citizenship in the region. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by that. On the one hand, the turn to what I have referred to elsewhere as Hindu nationalist statecraft, which is basically the Indian government using law to advance Hindu nationalist ideology, as was done with Kashmir and the revocation of Article 370, as was done with the Ayodhya judgment, as was done with the National Population Register in the Assamese context, and as was done, of course, with the introduction of the CAA and the Citizens Register at national level. It's basically a way of writing into law the ideology of Hindu nationalism. What that does is that it attenuates the political and civil citizenship of groups that are intensely vulnerable. Minority groups, of course, Muslims being a case in point here. So we have a situation where the politics of the powers that be in India right now are undermining political citizenship. That overlaps with the inequalities of neoliberal citizenship, which has basically seen, on the one hand, inequalities escalating wildly in India, meaning that the benefits of growth end up in fewer and fewer pockets at the same time as 60% of the population live on less than $3.10 a day, right? that is an attenuation of social citizenship. And right now, the challenge that I think needs to be met is that of forging activism at the intersection, at the meeting point of those two processes, asserting, first of all, the value and the necessity of civil and political citizenship being equal for all its limitations. That needs to be there. And it's really important to remember, of course, that struggles over citizenship is something that subaltern groups have always engaged in, one way or the other. And then to fuse that with demands for redistributive reform, radical redistributive reform, as a way of advancing something that India has never really seen, namely universal social citizenship. And to bear in mind that those have to be springboards towards more emancipated and more equal futures.
Thank you. That was great. That's a great note to end on. If you have anything to add, feel free before I sort of just give the closing statement. And if you want to say anything about your new work that I know is coming out.
Let me grasp this opportunity to do some shameless self-promotion and say that some of the questions that I've referred to now about the exigencies of the political exigencies of the current regime are discussed in this book here, which is an edited volume that I've put together with my good colleagues Kenneth O. Nilsen and Anand Vedja, which includes contributions from someone like Kavita Krishnan, who's been on this forum before me, from Siddharth Rajan, from Dolly Kikon, Nandini Sundar, many others who have many important things to say precisely about the trajectories, the origins, and the contestations around Indian democracy in this particular moment. Other than that, I just want to say it was a pleasure to be on here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Amani says, thank you so much. This was tremendous. Thank you, Amani, and everyone else who's stuck with us. If you have any feedback, either you, Alf, or anybody who's attending this session for us in terms of what we can do differently or what we did well, feel free to write to me at manjari@belongg.net or contact@belongg.net.
All right. Bye now.
Take care. Bye.